Welcome to Preaching Unpacked. I'm Randall Parton, the senior pastor here at St. John's United Methodist Church in Albuquerque, New Mexico.
And I'm Tiffany Holmes, and I am the associate pastor here.
During Preaching Unpacked, Tiffany and I talk about last week's sermon, some takeaways that we hope people got from the sermon, lessons or things to think about during the week. Some of the things that didn't make it into the sermon, those rabbits we didn't end up chasing, or topics or themes or things we thought of after the fact that we should have said but we didn't get a chance to say. And then we look ahead to next week's sermon. We typically start with a prayer, so let's open with prayer. A gracious Father, whose beloved Son, Jesus Christ, came down from heaven to be the true bread which gives life to the world, evermore give us this bread, that he may live in us and we in him, who lives and reigns with you in the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever. Amen.
Amen.
So we are in Lent, and we are doing a Lenten series that we're calling The Healing Journey. And it's all about broken relationships and trying to repair or mend some of the broken relationships in our lives. And these first 4 sermons in Lent, we've talked about some of the temptations that we face in terms of our own reactions, our own behaviors when things get hard in relationships sometimes, and we've all been there.
Yeah.
And this last Sunday, our topic or our theme was withdrawal and the temptation to deny that there's a problem, to kind of tiptoe around problems and not discuss them openly. The elephant in the room, that was a big metaphor that I used a fair amount on
Bruno.
Sunday. And Bruno, right. I can't forget about Bruno. I have to talk about Bruno. Maybe the elephant's name is Bruno. That's what was one thing I was thinking, is the elephant's name is Bruno. But the text that I used is from Matthew's Gospel, and it's Peter's denial of Jesus. Jesus has been arrested, and Peter's in this sort of vulnerable spot, and 3 times denies knowing Jesus, 3 times pretends that he isn't who they think he is. Mm-hmm. And that was the scriptural lens then for us to talk about the temptation to hold back, to not be our authentic selves, and to withhold from ourselves, from others, who we really are, and how sometimes that temptation to withdraw is really the easiest to fall prey to. It's the one that's just the easiest to just slide right into it and not realize that you're doing it. So a lot of takeaways. Oh my gosh, I had a lot of comments and further conversations after Sunday's sermon. All really, really good stuff, though, of people really wrestling with the temptation to withdraw, right? Mm-hmm. And so we talked about, I don't think that going along to get along is really the best option sometimes. Right. Having certain topics that are off topic or off limits, in relationships sometimes, got a little pushback on that, which I think is fair, really, because the example that was given to me was a circle of friends where they have diverse political viewpoints, but they value each other's friendships, and so they all have this implicit agreement that they just don't talk politics. Right, that their relationship is based on their friendship, and this is just not something they agree not to talk about.
That's like the
things.
off limit.
Right, and that is a conscious choice that everybody's making for the sake of the relationship. And so that was, and I'm still chewing on that. I think I'm trying to decide whether I think that is. I think there are times when that is a good option. And my response to this person was, and this is why I also said, if you're tempted to withdraw, if you're tempted to sort of dance around something that you feel like you can't talk about, ask yourself what's important to you about this relationship. What is meaningful for you in this relationship, and have that conversation with these people. Yeah. Even to say, let's not talk about politics, at least names the elephant in the room. And we are all in agreement that this is just something that we're not going to talk about. It's not the same as sort of actively withdrawing and just sort of when the topics come up just to be silent and not engage. Right. I think having an agreement among a circle of friends that this is what this friendship is about and that is not what this friendship is about is somewhat different, but it also is a little heartbreaking, right?
Well, and I would wonder, how do they feel like that has impacted their relationship and like the depth of the relationship?
I think it's a trade-off, right? I mean, I think it ensures that the friendship continues, that the relationship and this group that they're a part of can go on, but it is kind of a bitter acknowledgement that there is an aspect of that relationship that is just off limits for them. And I think for some people, this is the other piece of it that I think is hard. I think for some people, particularly when it gets into politics and having conversations about politics, for some people, the sun rises and sets on their political viewpoints, right? And so there just is no other space for them. And I think for a lot of us, there's a lot more freedom.
Right.
You know, we, for better or for worse, we compartmentalize our politics, our ideology, some of these things that can be a sensitive issue, and we do that for the sake of maintaining friendships and relationships.
Yes.
But I still think there's a bit of sadness with that.
Well, and I think some of it, there's two parties in this. Is the thing that's difficult, that when you talk about relationships, is that I think there's been this, I feel like, an increasing tendency to villainize people that have a different view than you. And one of the things that's been particularly concerning to me regarding politics is equating a particular political stance with your faith in Christianity. You know, that if you don't believe a certain thing, then it brings into question your faithfulness to Christ. And that is really problematic. It makes those kinds of discussions really difficult.
It makes them off limits, right?
Yeah.
Because there's not, you basically cede any kind of common ground. You take away any potential for reframing the conversation in a way that is more conciliatory, is easier to sort of to figure out what the common ground is. But if everything is sort of, if the Venn diagram is sort of two circles stacked on top of each other, then there is no space for any flexibility or navigating some of that tension. And I mean, personally, I am fond of saying I think lots of things.
Yes. Lots of things about lots of...
I think lots of things about lots of things. And so I think I think some of us are just more comfortable with ambiguity and nuance than others. And maybe that's an elephant in the room too, that we need to be frank about and say, I'm glad that you're so clear on this. I'm not as clear as you are on this. In fact, I might differ than you, but I understand where, where sort of your arguments come from. And it's the certitude that is just really difficult sometimes.
Well, and just of saying, if you do differ, that you are wrong at a fundamental faith level.
Yeah.
That is really difficult. And I know I personally have struggled with that. And the times regarding politics where I have really felt myself have like a almost visceral reaction is those times when it's equating your political views with your faith. And that to believe something other, that you're not being a faithful Christian.
Right. Yeah.
And I just, it's more nuanced than that.
And I think the most productive conversations that I've had along those lines have been with people that there is genuine mutual affection and friendship, right? And so you can talk about that. I think, and that's part of the difficulty with being separated from each other during the pandemic, with the sort of the hyperpolarization of our politics and culture right now, is it makes it harder to find those connections where there is common ground, or at least you can say, again, I understand that this is black and white for you, it just isn't for me.
Right.
And do that in a way that is kind and invitational and welcoming and not judgmental. But Bishop Ken Carter has this term that he used a lot recently, and it's this notion of convicted humility, right? Which I love, because it's that you do have your convictions, you do have your beliefs, and there are things that are firm for you and black and white,
Right.
but you also have a certain sense of humility, right? And acknowledgement that I may be wrong, because the reality is none of us has all of this figured out.
Yes.
And ultimately, we're not saved by our knowledge. We're
No.
saved by grace through faith. And that means we don't have all the answers, and we don't have to have all the right answers all the time for us to be in right relationship with God, because
and
it's
we
not
are
us
not
doing
perfect.
that. And we're not perfect, right?
There's room for error. I think that's always been a little of my argument since a young child regarding especially politics, is I don't feel comfortable pinning my hopes and dreams and believing of everything on a fallible human being.
It's very risky.
It just doesn't make any sense to me. And so I think even for me, just of having to take that time to acknowledge that really is what's going on in me, is that kind of holding that intention of, we are people, no person is perfect. And your faith in that, it really makes me uncomfortable.
Yeah. We talked a little bit about this a couple of weeks ago in terms of assuming positive intent, right?
Yeah.
And I joked in the sermon, it's one of my pet peeves when people assume intent on my part, right? And my comment was, I don't even know what my intentions are at the time, because I think too many things,
Yes.
right? And so I think that, there is a certain amount of humility that says, I could be wrong. Mm-hmm. And you could be wrong. And that'll be okay. There are worse things than being wrong.
And then we don't know.
Yeah, and we don't know. Yeah, we don't know.
Well, and I think withdrawal is very appropriate in the time that we've been in, because, all of us really were kind of forced to withdraw from one another.
Yeah. Yeah, we were.
And figuring out how to re-engage has been really
fascinating.
Oh gosh.
Fascinating.
It's just a study in, I just think to myself, 20, 30 years from now, can you imagine what sociologists and psychologists and everything studying
Sure.
this?
Yeah.
Because never before have we been able to process this almost like a group think type of thing. And never have we all been going through kind of that same situation, but having completely different experiences of it.
Right. Partly because of where we get our information and how we consume our information. And
it's almost like we were forced to make our circle smaller and withdraw.
Yeah. Yeah. It's been interesting thinking about the elephant in the room.
Yes.
Speaking of Bruno, a lot of people really have given a lot of thought to that.
Yeah.
And it makes me wonder if in good ways, but it makes me wonder if we all know what we mean when we say there's an elephant in the room, right?
What do you mean?
So I think the elephant in the room is something big, right? That we all kind of know it's there, but we all kind of pretend it's not there, just for the sake of just getting through life. So it's been interesting since Sunday to hear back people talking about elephants in the room, and I'm thinking to myself, is that really an elephant though?
Is that it? Yeah.
Is that it? But I love that people are exploring it, right? And I really love that people are using that metaphor, that image, to open up the possibility that, are there things that we should be talking about that we're not talking about? Are there things that we all know is happening or is a concern, and we just haven't quite named them yet? I think that's really powerful and really healthy.
Yes.
But I also wonder if we can overdo it, right? Because everything can't be an elephant in the room.
I think the language of it, are you talking about an elephant in the room, something that we disagree on? Or are you talking about things that everybody knows is happening, but they don't want to talk about? I mean, of course, working in foster care, my mind immediately goes to situations where I have been sitting in a room and there is an elephant in the room, say like, trigger warning, like abuse is happening and we're just not going to talk about that. I mean, when I think of withdrawal and the elephant in the room, that's what I think about.
Okay. Yeah.
Where somebody's going to sit there and say, everything's fine in our family. And I'm sitting in the room saying, yeah, it's not.
Yeah, let's
and
talk about this
that's the elephant in the room, right?
Yeah,
Is that you're saying things are okay and fine when everybody knows it's not. Whereas I think what some people are thinking of is almost like we disagree on things and we don't want to talk about that.
Yeah.
And I think that's like definitional, maybe.
Yeah, definitely. And I, as you're saying that, I wonder too if there's a possibility sometimes, because I ask people to name the elephant in the room. I use the Randy Pausch quote where he said, if there's an elephant in the room, introduce him, right?
Yeah.
Let's just say,
It's Bruno.
It's Bruno. His name's Bruno. But that may come as a surprise to some people, right? To say, I think there's an elephant in the room. Can we talk about this a little bit? And that may come as a surprise to people. But I think some of that is just our capacity for self-deception, right? Our capacity for denial.
Self-awareness.
Yeah. But it's been really interesting. This whole series has been really interesting. I personally have been stretched in lots of ways in terms of thinking about how pastoral this content is and how it speaks to our political divides, but also how fragile so many of our relationships have been. And, we've talked about this before, but just we all have these sort of frayed relationships in our lives.
There's brittleness.
Yeah, there is a brittleness. And I think speaking to some of this, I think to be fair with the elephant in the room conversation, there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach to this either, right? And so, I did take time in this Sunday sermon to say, look, if there is a question of safety and your security, your well-being, please don't hear me saying that withdrawal is not something you should engage in. If you are, feeling unsafe, if you, feel like for your own health and well-being, you need to pull yourself aside, then that is perfectly legitimate. That you are entitled to that.
Really great.
And so I think sort of maybe fine-tuning that a little bit to say this is not an all sort of one-size-fits-all or a blanket kind of conversation. This is really more about the sort of ordinary kind of brittleness of relationships and friendships and politics that we're going through. This does not speak to every situation and every circumstance.
Well, and and I even think of, and again, this is a matter of praying through this and navigating this, of when, I've had situations where I realize, oh, wow, this is really toxic. Yeah. And that for me, it's kind of like I've made attempts to come back and try to have common views, but sometimes others don't assume positive intent. They have ill intent, and and it's not a fair conversation. Yeah. And I've had moments where I've had to just say, I mean, withdrawal, I feel like, is you just withdraw and there's pain and misunderstanding left versus trying to gracefully exit a toxic situation. And I mean, even for me, I struggle with what that looks like. But when I reach a point to where I feel like I'm just banging my head against a wall.
That is part of the dynamic, and I don't think this came in the sermon at all, but is that, it really does take people in relationship for there to be that relationship. Yeah. And it can't be asymmetrical. It can't be one-sided. And that's why I think it's important for you to as you're being tempted to withdraw, to think about, what is important to me about this relationship. And not to get too far ahead, in a couple of weeks, the topic is forgiveness. And sometimes there is a season of pulling away and withdrawing for health and well-being, for for safety and security. but there's also a possibility for hope and redemption, even in that. And so it's not, so sort of pulling yourself out does not have to be, the sort of the final act of that relationship. Right. It could be that there's something more, and it may be something that is years down the road, and that if the other person gets healthy, you get healthy, situations change, circumstances change, the nature of the relationship could change. I think God is at work in all of this, right? Yeah. And so even if we feel the need to take a step back or sort of cordon off certain topics for the sake of our friendship and our relationship, our theology of grace is that God is still working on that stuff. And so even if we just sort of have to say, okay, we're going to set this aside and trust that God is going to do something with this, even if I can't, that's not a problem.
Well, and even just we're human, and relationships are so complicated. And the thing that's always been difficult for me is it's like two or more people. For it to be a relationship, it has to be two or more people.
Yeah, it has to be mutuality.
I can't control what the other person does. All I can do is what I'm bringing to the table and how I'm allowing God to move in me and convict and use me. And I've had situations through especially like the political, that I just realized at one point I was like, it's not a fair fight. It doesn't matter how I come to this situation or how much I try to talk about it or express, hey, like, you believe this, I believe this, that I'm characterized in a certain way that, there were situations that I had to make a very conscious decision of, I'm just going to exit this conversation. It's not a conversation, and it's not healthy. And I just, for whatever reason, like, we couldn't come to it in a healthy way. And it was really painful for me. It was people I really, really care about, but it just was so unhealthy that I just thought it's not, and to let them know I'm always here, I'm always open, but the way that this is going, I can't navigate this.
Yeah.
It's hard.
It is hard. It's hard not being able to be fully present with each other,
and you
that's the pain.
I think that really hits the heart of it for me, was that I felt with people that I've known for a long time that I felt really knew me, that they would say things like, I don't know what's happened to you, or really kind of like, Tiffany, you've really gone astray in your faith. And I'm thinking, God and I are really pretty good on this. Yeah. And I think, again, it's that villainizing, and for me, just realizing the way that all of this is being approached is not healthy or fair for anyone.
Yeah.
And how do I then exit gracefully is hard.
Yeah, it's almost like you wish sometimes that when we're faced with the temptation to withdraw, that we could somehow have a sort of the meta conversation about that, and ask why the other person is feeling that. Because I think sometimes, and I've seen this in relationships sometimes, where one person starts to sort of pull away and the other person starts to push them away. Because it's sort of that's kind of self-preservation there. It's like, well, if you don't want to be here, I don't want you here either, kind of thing. And it's not even at the sort of at the conscious level. It's sort of subconscious.
If you're going to leave, I'm going to make you leave.
Right.
Yeah.
You can't fire me. I quit.
Totally. It's what I would see happen with kids a lot, that, they would start to share, and then I would know the blowback would be coming really quickly of like, you're going to see who I am and you're not going to like who I am. So I'm going to make it easy for you to walk away. And versus, I think for me, the most painful part of a lot of the conversations that have been happening is just an unwillingness to really be able to express, hey, like, you think this way about it, but I absolutely would never argue that you have a relationship with Christ, but I have a relationship with Christ as well, and I'm not hearing the same thing. It's not playing out in my life the same way. But that doesn't mean that you're wrong and I'm right, or you're wrong, I'm wrong and you're right. It's just...
Yeah. I wonder if, and this is not something that we've explored at all in this series, but I think, sort of kind of praying over those relationships and pray for the kind of tender hearts that really make those relationships and those hard conversations possible. Because it can't be one-sided, right? It can't be. And so sometimes, and maybe this gets into the forgiveness thing too, is that, there are times when, even if there's brokenness and and there isn't reconciliation, there isn't healing there, maybe all that you can offer is, prayers for tenderness, prayers for willingness to be in relationship and community at some point.
And I think a lot of it too, you said something about just that wanting to be known, like that authenticness of your real self. And I think at the heart of it, that was what is so painful for me, but for so many others that I know of, is that you share, hey, I really want to engage with you on this, but it and in certain circles, I mean, for me, especially growing up in certain areas, it was kind of like, you just nod your head and you agree, right? You just smile and you agree, because any other response is not okay. And it's seen as being wrong. Yeah. And for me to finally have the courage to say, hey, like, I see it maybe a different way. That, I mean, and maybe it's just again, those relationships were more brittle than you think. But I think of, somebody, we hear all the time about, children that will, come out as gay and share that. And it's just, it is not accepted. Right. And how do they stay in that situation and still be their authentic selves, but not be abused or in a toxic situation? It's like, and again, I think that's the special scenarios that you're talking about. But I think for us having the wisdom to know what is the point when withdrawing in a graceful way is the safest, most healthy option. Yeah. And I don't know what that is.
Well, and the tragedy is sometimes it's not, in circumstances like that, it's not a matter of somebody choosing to withdraw, but being forced out, to be forced.
That's the clarification.
To be kind of, shamed or shunned or just cut off from relationship, that they're not choosing to withdraw. That is a choice that's being made for them, and just how painful and how harsh that is.
Yes.
And I think again that's where, just got to pray for tender hearts for people, for them to realize, pushing people away, not just sort of pulling yourself away, but pushing others away, just can't be what God intends for us either. No. Ultimately, I mean, and so pushing people away who disagree with you, or pulling away from people who disagree with you, that both of those really come at a pretty high price for our own well-being, for the well-being of the community, and it's just really tragic.
Because when certain voices exit the conversation, I mean, I think that was the saddest thing for me, was knowing I'm choosing to withdraw my voice from the conversation. And that's sad.
It is sad.
Like, it really, it grieves me. But you can only have a conversation in a relationship when it's a two-party system. Two-party system, it's, At
least some mutuality, mutual respect, mutual love, unconditional, right? Because if the love or the affection is conditioned on,
believing the right way,
believing
or saying the right things.
or saying the right things.
I think that might be why the political divide has been so hurtful for people, is because it's almost comes across as the relationship was conditional, either on being silent or agreeing.
Yeah.
And there's no other option.
In which case, to circle back to the conversations that have come out of the sermon on Sundays, maybe those circle of friends who agree not to talk about politics, that is a healthier option, right? Because at least implicit, is A, recognition that we disagree.
Yeah.
And B, that's okay. Because our friendship, our relationship is important enough for us to set this topic aside so that we can do the things that we do enjoy being together. It's still a little heartbreaking to me.
It's complicated.
It is complicated.
But it's, I mean, and I think that's what you're seeing in this. Or it's not an
ultimatum.
Relationships are complicated.
Yes, they all are.
And I keep on thinking about, it would be really interesting to look at this series from the standpoint of God's relationship with us.
Ooh.
So, are there times when withdrawing would be, sometimes the most gracious option. I mean, I think about Romans 1, about God gave them over, and it's interesting to me. It's like it's described as God's wrath. And I heard someone say or thought about it one time that what if God's wrath is God giving you over, just kind of almost stepping back, of saying,
oh,
okay, do as you want. It's like you think that God's wrath would be like, but what if like the wrath is God saying, like, stepping out of the equation in a way.
So he pays your money and he takes your chances.
I know. And I'm like, I don't even know if that's like theologically correct.
Do what you want and deal with the consequences.
Yeah.
Right? So I was thinking of withdrawal, and I did think about this, but I didn't mention it in the sermon, in the garden, right?
Yes.
When Adam and Eve sort of realize, we've messed up. And they withdraw.
They withdraw.
That was that sort of that visceral kind of initial, and God's like, where are you? Where are you hiding? But that was their reaction, was to sort of to pull away. Right.
But then they ended up leaving. And that was one of the questions that the youth were kind of like, well, okay, so God cast them out. I was like, but God went with them. I mean, that's the thing. Is that, yes, they were cast out of the garden, but it's really clear as you read after that God went with them, whether they realized it or not.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of, but then, thinking, because it's like, oh my gosh, you could go down this road and think of all kinds. I think about the prodigal son. The father was like, okay, and was that a form of withdrawal?
And is that, and the older brother also does some of that,
yes,
right? Because he refuses to come in. He's like, that son of yours, not my brother, but
but the father, like, the son was like, I want to leave, and the father is like,
okay,
yeah, okay, I will. But I think the part of that equation is the father was still waiting and always ready to welcome, that. And again, even if when the Roman scripture of, like God gave them over, again, I always picture almost kind of like God just like, okay, kind of like hands off, which opens up it's really uncomfortable, but you can't read Romans 1 without knowing the rest of the story is that, okay, God gave them over, but then God, actually inserts God back in it as a human and dies.
Right,
so it's like you see that. I don't even think withdrawal would be like an appropriate word because it has a negative connotation.
Yeah.
But I think it would be really interesting to look at these relational dynamics
definitely.
like, how does God engage with us?
Right. And map that onto sort of the larger story of God and God's people. With the withdrawal, the assuming positive intent versus not assuming positive intent. That would be fascinating.
Yeah. I mean, and I had never really thought, when at the very first you said you didn't realize how much brokenness was in the passion narratives. Mm-hmm. And I hadn't either. Like,
everybody here is broken. Right, we're all broken. Every character in the story is broken.
What a cluster!
Yeah,
like they were all.
Well,
except for Jesus. I mean,
but don't you think that's part of the tragedy of it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's like this did not have to go this way, but it kind of did, right? Because this is the way we are. This is the way all of us are. Mm-hmm. We engage in these behaviors, we scapegoat, we seek an easy out.
We wash our hands.
We wash our
blame.
hands. Yeah. I mean, all those things are very, very, very human and very tragic.
They are.
Right. And with in Jesus' case, with very serious consequences.
Yes.
And like I said a couple weeks ago in the sermon, but they kind of have real consequences for others too, right?
I mean, you see that in Peter.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, how, torn apart he was. I mean, it just, I think for me, like the beginning of the sermon, it really kind of took my breath away to look at the passion narratives that way, mm-hmm. of the relational dynamic.
Yeah.
And then kind of looking back at it and seeing Jesus navigating through all of that was profound to me.
Yes. That all these things are happening, all this upset, all this sort of tragic human brokenness is happening, and he is sort of walking right through it, right?
God.
Just walking right through it. In a way that I think just sort of adds a whole new perspective on all of this. Mm-hmm. And I think that's some of what I'll talk about this coming Sunday, looking ahead to this Sunday is so we're shifting gears a little bit, and just to kind of set this up a little bit better. We're shifting gears a little bit. So the first 4 sermons were about temptations that we face on the healing journey, things that we want to maybe try and avoid or sort of figure out how to navigate a little bit better. The next 2 weeks are going to be more positive. So not necessarily temptations, but this coming Sunday is having realistic expectations of each other, right? To sort of to not have sort of hyper fantasized views about the other person, what's possible, to really see them as human and sort of with all their frailties, with all their struggles, and to sort of allow them the gift of being imperfect. Mm-hmm. And so, watching Jesus kind of navigate through this and allowing the people around him to be broken in this part of it, and still sort of making his way to the cross.
DG always says, he loves, being with people that are not Christian. And he will always say to the church, like, you can't expect somebody that's not a Christian to act like a Christian. And I add, but you want to assume that those who are Christian would act like a Christian. But it's, our expectations,
Yeah.
What do we expect of people?
And unfortunately, and I think this is part of the sermon as well, unfortunately, we don't verbalize those expectations, right? We measure people against our internalized expectations of what they are, who they are, what they're going to be. And this is what's really hard about pastoral ministry too, right? is knowing that people have expectations that you're going to be a certain way, do certain things a certain way, but you only find out afterwards that you messed up.
Right.
Like you didn't quite jump through the hoop the way you were expected to jump through the hoop, that you didn't know was there.
Yeah.
And so, having realistic expectations of each other, or at least acknowledging that you have expectations of the other, right, is such an important part of this journey as well, because we project on others sometimes, our are hoped for. And this is especially true in relationships and families, and where some of the brokenness comes from, right? It's because we're so disappointed, they're not the way we want them to be.
I thought about,
any of us is.
when DG and I first got married, it's like, I remember growing up, my mom would say something to me like, if your daddy comes home and doesn't do the dishes, and I always I'm just daddy's girl. I would be the one that would kind of catch him at the door and be like, hey, heads up,
you might want to
go wash the dishes.
But then,
I'll help you.
Then
but
those
like,
expectations are at least verbalized, right? It's like, oh, I need to do the dishes.
I would think like that's not even fair. Like he doesn't know, and so. But then I noticed myself doing that when we would get married, and I would think, well, like,
why isn't he doing that?
Look at all of that, and then I would have to stop and think to myself, okay, remember yourself as a little girl standing at the door, being like, hey, heads up, do the dishes, and thinking. He doesn't know. I mean, and like DJ will say, I'm not a mind reader.
Exactly.
And so that was a real growth area for us in our marriage because, I tended to be a little more withdrawn and wouldn't really say those things, whereas DG was a lot more open and verbal to where he would say to me, I know, so unlike him, but he would say to me, it was really profound of him saying, I am not a mind reader.
Yeah.
I don't know what's going on in your head. And me having the awareness to say, you're right. Like it would be it really wouldn't be fair for me to expect that just by nature of who I am.
Yeah. So that's our topic for next week, is having realistic expectations. And the text is from Luke's gospel, where it talks about how Jesus is, hung between two thieves, two bandits. And Jesus says from the cross, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. And how much of our own relationships would be healthier if we sort of had that mindset as like, they probably don't know what they're doing.
Yeah.
They don't know they're missing the mark that I haven't told them exists.
Yeah.
They're not aware that I have these expectations for them, that, even on the cross, Jesus really understood the brokenness, that they don't even know what they're doing. They don't have the first clue what they're doing. Forgive them, and just how powerful that is to have those clear understandings of just how frail we are and how frail the other is.
That's one of the most difficult conversations I've had to have with kids.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sure.
With their parents,
Yeah.
is them saying, do they not love me? Do they not want me? And I'm like, they're just people.
Yeah, they're doing the best they can. And sometimes it's just not all that great, but they're trying. I mean, everybody tries. I mean, that's what I said a couple weeks ago. Is like, I think everybody, by and large, most of us are trying the best we can to do the best we can.
Some of us have a lot more loads and baggage that we're walking around with trying to try the best that we can.
Yeah. I mean, or we're sort of, we're hamstrung or handicapped in ways that fundamentally unfair, but not a thing we can do about it, right?
It's good.
It's been a really good series. It's surfaced all kinds of...
You're really stirring the pot.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, God is, but I love the prayers at the end. From
the Corey community. Yes, they've been really good. Just hundreds of prayers that they collected during the pandemic and the shutdown and everything, but also during the seasons, and just really powerful prayers. Such a wonderful witness of the community in terms of their peace work, their reconciliation, working across differences, and really trying to speak into these divides that exist. So grateful for them. Well, thanks for joining us for Preaching Unpacked. We'll see you next week when we talk about having realistic expectations. And until then, we'll see you next time.
Bye.